So this is an x-ray of my leg and my ankle. So you can see this is a nail that goes all the way down from my knee to the bottom of, through the tibia, to the bottom of the tibial bone. That's actually right through the centre. Now if I'll turn it this way, that's basically the proper way of looking at it. So that's the ankle joint, which is completely arthritic. And these are 4 rather large screws, several inches long, which have fixed the subtalar joint into place, which basically gives me almost no movement throughout the foot, although my ankle joint here can move about 5 degrees, but because of the arthritis, it is exceptionally painful. So I've been disabled for 23 years now. God, it's such a long time. I was living and working in Sydney, and I was in an interdepartmental soccer match between 2 branches of a government department, and I think we went out to Wentworth Park, it was, and to play this game, and everything was going pretty good. I'd set up 2 goals, and I was steaming into the box to basically hopefully score the 3rd. And I just remember seeing the ball and just going to whack it as hard as I could at the goal, and next thing I just heard this sound that was like the cracking of a tree in half. It was just a horrible smashing sound, and I went to stand on my leg and it basically just wasn't there. And then when I looked down, all I saw was, it's like I had another joint. There was another joint beneath my knee. My leg was just flopping beneath it, and the bone was sticking out of the middle of the leg a little bit. And so I just laid down on the ground and just stared up at the sky. So my recovery was a little bit of a disaster, really. For starters, I waited something like 6 hours or more in the hospital in Sydney for the leg to be basically reduced and fixed. So they put a nail in the leg, so they drilled into the top of the tibia and inserted a metal rod, they call it a nail, the whole way down, and they screwed it in place. And then my leg was very swollen, so they actually put a back slab on, some plaster of Paris just on the back of the leg. So they didn't actually put a whole cast on, because I'd actually developed something called compartment syndrome, which is basically when your tissues become so swollen they can't, they need to basically drain all the fluid out of your legs. So they basically cut or sliced, I suppose, with a razor in parts of my leg, from what I can remember. So I was in hospital for 2 weeks at first, and I remember it just being excruciatingly painful. There were some days when Renee came into hospital, I could not talk to her. I was in so much pain, and they were trying to do physio on me already. I can't remember. I was in and out of hospital so many times subsequently that I've forgotten. So after 2 weeks, I went home for a couple of weeks, and then when I went back in after a couple of weeks for a checkup with the orthopaedic surgeon, they noticed that, the compartment syndrome, so I don't know whether it had improved that much, but they took the back slug off, and a lot of my foot was basically black, and I couldn't actually feel it. I'd actually severed the nerve that went down to my foot, so my foot was completely numb. So I think it was something like 2.5 months went by or something like that, and maybe 3, I can't remember, but there was no reduction in the tibia. There was no evidence of the bone actually growing. There was a centimetre gap in the tibia, and they just couldn't see any bone growing there. And one afternoon or morning, I just got up and my leg was just all red, and it was just excruciatingly painful. It was, I mean, I was in a lot of pain anyway, but this was just, you know, it was like it was getting infected. So basically I went to hospital, just waited for hours in the emergency, and when I eventually got in and they did a battery of tests, and they basically said, well, you know, your bone's got infected now, you've got osteomyelitis. I mean, the thing that you got to understand is I was 26. I just emigrated to Australia in 1994, and you know, I was just full of big dreams about moving to this new country, and you know, just had a lot of ideas about what I wanted to do, and just loved travelling. Basically, that's why I came here. Australia is such a great country of travellers, and so I remember when I first came here, I lived in Brisbane and on the Gold Coast for about a year or so, just basically having a holiday. And I'd go for long walks and runs on the beach. I'd run down from Surfers Paradise, or I think we lived in around about Broadbeach at the time. And I'd go for these long runs on the beach all the way down to Burleigh Heads and back. And I just absolutely loved it. I used to do a lot of cross country at school, so you know, it was something I absolutely loved, was just going for a long run and just to get your heart going, and you know, just getting fit and stuff like that. Yeah, it was just absolutely amazing. So basically with the osteomyelitis, they checked me in straight away into the hospital, and I actually ended up being in there for a whole month on a drip. It was the most painful drip I'd ever been on, because it's the medicine that they gave me was quite caustic. They had to basically change the drip almost every couple of hours, which was quite exhausting. So if you imagine being in there for a month and someone stabbing you with a needle every couple of hours trying to change a drip, I just ended up with so many bruises on both arms, and they also stuck me in the geriatric ward, because the orthopaedic ward, I think, was being you know, was actually being refurbished. So, and that's when I sort of started noticing some other symptoms because of all the medical trauma that I was experiencing, and just not knowing whether I was gonna actually get better at this stage. So the other thing they noticed with the osteomyelitis was that where I'd actually broke my leg, I'd broken both bones, obviously, the tibia and the fibula, right in the middle of the leg, is that it had sort of all turned to mush, sort of on the skin, and sort of the, you know, the muscle, the tissue basically was all pussy and mushy. And so one of the things they had to do also daily, I think, or a couple of times a day, I can't really remember, they'd shoot me up with really powerful sedatives, don't know what, sometimes morphine, sometimes some other concoction medicines, and they'd basically get this big needle, and they'd just clean out the wound and shove gauze down there, all the way down to the bone, basically. Not that was a long way, because really there wasn't hardly any sort of blood vessels there, sort of, you know, or flesh that was actually, you know, helping for this tibial bone to actually fix itself basically and knit together. Anyway, they eventually let me go home after about a month, and luckily I still had this job at this government department in Sydney, and they looked after me really well. You know, basically they let me have as much time off as possible to deal with the issue, and I was doing sedentary duties, and actually that's when I got into IT. I basically there was an opportunity for an IT trainer, so I ended up going over to the IT team, and just learned how to become a trainer. I did the Australian Institute of Management Trainer the Trainer course, and I had a really good time there for a couple of years, training people how to use sort of early versions of software. Even though my degree is actually in geology, a lot of my friends had actually gotten into IT back in the UK, and it was a really growing industry in the mid-90s, so I thought, well, this is a good place to stick my foot in the door, you know. I'd actually, just before I'd broken the leg, I was doing a course. I was paying for a private course in C++ programming, because I thought that was really going to sort of take off as a career, and you know, it sort of suited part of the way my brain sort of worked as well. Even though I was no mathematical genius, I seemed to be able to really understand sort of algorithms and sort of have a big picture view of how they sort of worked. So I was doing this course, and I was getting quite high marks in it. And yeah, that's I was quite a few months into that. I paid a heap of money, and that's when I broke the leg. So breaking the leg is sort of, I had to sort of cancel that course in C++ programming, because I realised after a couple of months that all my energy had to be focused on getting better, and it really does sap your mental energy. It's all, when you're in pain, it's all you can focus on is the pain. You can't focus on anything else. So after a few months of actually being on strong medication to basically really rid the osteomyelitis out of my system, this was sort of getting on to I don't know, 9-10 months after the initial accident. The fibula had fully healed. The tibia still hadn't healed. So I think it was around about a year, at the year mark, when the osteomyelitis was finally, I was given the okay on that. That's basically what they had to do. So I basically had a gap like this in my tibial bone for a year while they were getting rid of the osteomyelitis, basically the bone infection. So then I went in to see a surgeon, and he basically said, we're going to have to break your leg again. So I went into hospital again. They broke my leg, which was basically just cutting a section out of the fibula and bringing the tibial bone together. So it actually reduced the length of my right leg by around about 1 centimetre or more in the act of actually doing that. And they had to take out the nail that was in there and replace it with a new one as well, just to make sure everything was fresh and not infected. So I remember when I was in hospital that time, one thing I haven't mentioned is during that whole period, my actual foot, because I couldn't feel my foot and I couldn't feel it for 6 months, it actually took 6 months for the nerves to start to grow back. So it was at the 6 months mark I started to be able to feel parts of my foot, because from the ankle down it was dead. I just couldn't feel anything. It was like I had a zombie foot, or a Frankenfoot as I call it. I noticed parts of the foot started coming back. I started to get some feeling, which was just fantastic. However, it started coming back hypersensitive, so it was sort of tingly and sort of painful, and but I mean in a good way. I was happy that it was starting to come back, the feelings, and I can't remember how long it took for most of the foot to come back, most of the nerves to grow back, but it was over a period of quite a few months. But I was left with extreme hypersensitivity, so it was not quite painful to touch, but in parts it was, and I couldn't, if you touched my foot, I'd just sort of jerk away because of the hypersensitivity. But the real are still, and the were are still patches of the foot that basically are still completely numb. My big toe is numb. Several of the toes, parts of those are numb, and parts of the bottom of the foot are numb. And one thing I hadn't mentioned up until now is the foot was at 45 degrees to the actual leg itself. If you look straight on, you'd see that the bottom of the foot was like that. So that's my leg. So if my leg's straight like this, the foot was at 45 degrees because I don't know whether it was the compartment syndrome or the nerve damage or a combination of both, but muscles had atrophied and basically pulled up on one side, and so my foot was extremely just stiff, basically stiff as a board, and atrophied, and it also become shrunken in size. It became quite a bit smaller than my left foot. This whole time I was walking on crutches, and sometimes a walking stick as well. So, but yeah, mostly crutches basically, and which was pretty painful. So they re-broke my leg, and finally the tibia actually healed after a year or so. Can't remember exactly how long it was. It was over a year, I think. That was such tremendous relief, because it was sort of the first time that I felt as though something was going the right way. I don't know whether at that stage I'd come to the realisation that it was never ever going to be really good. I don't know. I'm a positive person. I'm a glass half full person, so I'm always optimistic about stuff. So I never thought that I wouldn't fully recover even at that stage. But you can sort of tell when you talk to orthopaedic surgeons and physiotherapists that they sort of keep quiet. They don't really say the whole story. So you sort of think, they're not telling me something. They're not telling me something. I went to see a plastic surgeon around about that stage as well, because they were thinking that in order for the tibia to heal after it was re-broken, that they'd need to basically cut out a section behind the calf muscle and sort of flap it around to the front of the tibia so that it was getting enough blood into the tissue for the tibia to basically heal in that area. Now this really sort of disturbed me at the time. I thought, no way am I having this this piece of skin move around to the front, and I just aesthetically it would sort of didn't appeal to me at all. So what I started doing was I just started walking around where I lived, which was sort of in the seaside suburb of Manly in Sydney, on my crutches everywhere, all hours a day. I just walk up and down the pathways of Balgowlah and down sort of Manly Beach and up and down the hills. And people must have thought, who's this just lunatic, because in my head I thought, I've got to increase the blood flow, I've got to increase the blood flow to this area so that the tibia actually heals, so that was it. I was just off like the clappers every day, on my crutches, just walking, miles, just getting excruciatingly sore armpits, from all the rubbing of the crutches under my arms, and but I just, started, getting really sort of muscly up top, because of all the effort I was putting into, sort of attempting to increase the blood flow basically around the tibia. So thankfully this walking around like a lunatic on my crutches seemed to work, because the tibia healed, and next thing was the foot. So basically, because my foot was deformed, I went to see a specialist ankle surgeon, and the idea was to basically bring the foot flat. So that I at least had some sort of improved ambulation, basically, because I could not walk on the side of my foot forever. It was just excruciatingly painful to do that. So what was recommended was a piece of surgery called a triple arthrodesis. So it's quite a complex procedure, and it involves basically I think cutting a wedge shape piece of bone out of the foot in one of the joints there, and at the same time as cutting this wedge shape out and flattening the foot, they have to fix it in place with some large screws. So there's 4 screws that go through at various angles in the foot to actually fix it in place. Now, thankfully, they didn't actually put a screw through the actual ankle joint itself, although by this stage it was just completely arthritic. I could barely move it. I could move it a few degrees, probably 5 at most, whereas your normal range of movement for an ankle joint is probably in excess of 30 degrees, 32, 35 degrees, something like that. Well, I could basically barely move it 5 degrees, and those 5 degrees were very painful because of the arthritis. So they performed the triple arthrodesis, basically. And that took quite a few months of recovery after that. And I think it was somewhere around the 2-year mark. It was the 2-year mark since I had the accident when I finally could basically drop the walking stick, drop the crutches, and actually I was able to start to take some of the first steps without any assistance whatsoever. 2 years it was, and that was an amazing feeling. That was a fantastic feeling, because I'd been up and down like a yo-yo. I thought it was getting better, I was getting worse, I was getting better, I was getting worse, I was getting better, I was getting worse. And it was just a constant mental battle, basically. Quite traumatic, quite exhausting. It was not very pleasant at all. And the thing about having medical trauma and having it for a couple of years and not know whether you're getting better is I'd also developed, and I did not know this at the time, it wasn't really sort of diagnosed, is that I developed post-traumatic stress disorder. So PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, is sort of, most people have heard of it in the battlefields. My grandfather actually was shot at the age of 18, fighting for the one of the Lancashire regiments under the command of Clement Attlee, who later became the British Prime Minister after the Second World War. So he was basically shot, had his lung blew out, and basically this very large Turkish sniper's bullet was lodged in his heart. He was actually shot just near Anzac Cove, actually, which is quite coincidental given my history of having emigrated to Australia. And he would have suffered from PTSD as well. I actually knew him as an adult. I was 24 when I emigrated to Australia, and he was about 94. He died when he was 96, so it was amazing that I knew him as an adult. But I'd say he probably had PTSD as well. I've certainly heard a few stories from my family about it, about the pain he was in. Anyway, with this bullet stuck near his heart for 25 years. So 2 years, I could start to walk again. Although what I noticed was I couldn't walk very far. It was pretty painful. It was, my walking technique wasn't brilliant. I had to really it was almost like being a baby again. You've been through the crawling stage, and now I had to learn to walk again, and I was walking completely differently. And I remember I said to Renee, I said, now that I can walk again, I want to go and do something to remind myself what walking is all about. And so I said, let's drive to Thredbo, and let's go up to Charlotte's Pass, and let's walk to the top of Kosciuszko. One thing I hadn't mentioned is that when I'd left university, I really wanted to travel. I was desperate to travel. I'd had a brother who'd spent many years in Africa, and he actually lived in Mombasa at the time, and he was off on a field trip somewhere in the Sudan. And I had this great idea. I just wanted something so diametrically opposed to anything I'd done before, and I wanted basically a culture shock, and I wanted an adventure. And because I'd just grown up in this working class household in the north of England, and we'd had this a cheap 1 week holiday to North Wales, which is about 100 miles away, every year, which was fantastic. I love the mountains of Wales and stuff like that, and that I think that's where my thirst for travel started there, the thirst for adventure. So basically because I had a degree in geology, I went down to the bank and I said, look, I've got this offer from this company to go and work on oil rigs. I'm starting in a couple of months. Can you loan me some money, because I want to go travelling? And they said, yeah, sure, here you go. Here's 1,500 quid. So I thought, wow, this is fantastic. I'd had a mate who'd gone and climbed Mont Blanc, and we were quite competitive at university. So I thought, yeah, Mont Blanc, yeah, that was about 15,000 feet or something like that. So I had a look on the map, did a bit of research. Mount Kenya, Point Lenana, which is one of the climbable peaks on Mount Kenya, was just over 16,500 feet, I think. I thought, yeah, I'm going to go there. I'll go and do that, So I flew to Kenya. I basically backpacked around the country, had a fantastic time, just saw some amazing things. And I 3 days, I took 3 days to climb Mount Kenya. And there was a glacier at the top, there was elephants at 10,000 feet. I remember just what a hard slog it was, and I'd never seen stars like that at night. They were so bright, it was almost like you could touch the Milky Way. And I remember getting right to the top of that mountain above the glacier at 6 in the morning, watching the sunrise, move over the African plains, and it was just the greatest experience of my life. It's one that I always look back on, even though subsequently, I have travelled quite. So we get to Charlotte's Pass. We've got nothing. We got no water. We got no food. I don't know what I was thinking. I just thought it'd just be, a 2-hour stroll there and back, just after my previous climbing experiences. I didn't factor in my leg at all. So basically, I can't remember how long it took. It was 16 kilometres. I basically limped the whole way. I was in excruciating pain the whole way, but I was going to do it. I was going to prove that I could get to the top of this bloody mountain, to prove I could walk again, to prove that it wasn't going to defeat me. So 8 hours I think it took or something. 8 hours, we were just drinking water out of streams and stuff, and we got back to Charlotte's Pass and we were just starving. I think we found a Mars bar in a shop somewhere. That's about it, in a vending machine or something, and I couldn't actually walk for the next 2 or 3 weeks. I had to take 2 or 3 weeks off work because I just couldn't move my foot. It was, the arthritis is just on fire. It was just, the whole foot was on fire. It was just incredibly painful, but it was worth it. So going through all this medical trauma, and it wasn't just me who went through it, it was Renee went through it with me. We decided, look, what's important in life? We already knew what was important in life, but sometimes it takes things like this to sort of really, kick it in really as to what is important. So we thought, no, we're going to go travelling. So we saved really hard for a few months, and we did, spent 4 months. We went to Africa. I took Renee back to Kenya. We went around Egypt, saw all the fantastic things you can see. Basically got a rail ticket, went all around Europe. I went back to England to visit my family, and then flew back via Hong Kong, I think. So yeah, that was our first sort of big trip together. It was painful though, I tell you what. I took this big backpack, this big Berghaus backpack. I just wasn't thinking, and just limped the whole way around Europe with this big backpack. I was just a complete nutcase. I just really didn't give it any thought. It's like, just, you need to have a different method here. You can't do this. You just kind of, just no matter how much pain I was in, I just kept going, basically. Anyway, once we got back from that trip, the IT section of this department was sort of being outsourced. So I went for a job in an investment bank, and I basically won the job. I had about 3 interviews there. I can't remember what, but the thing that was amazed me about going for that interview process within an investment bank is that they want to make sure that they've got the right people working in the bank. So they give every prospective employer that they're going to offer a contract or offer a permanent employment to, they gave them a psychological test. So I remember this psychological test was about 3 hours long, and it involved probably the Stanford Binet test and Myers-Briggs, I can't remember, as well as an IQ test. So I remember doing that and sitting down with them, and one of the things she told me was that I was in the top 1% for mathematical reasoning, which sort of blew me away. I was like, really? Wow. At least this injury hasn't affected my brain, hasn't affected my cognition, because I was never really brilliant at maths at school. But like I said, I was I'm a sort of a visual person. I'm good at pattern recognition, and I'm a bit polymathic in my taste. So I was like, yeah, that's pretty good. Top 1%, Yeah, so that sort of gave me a lot of confidence going into that job. So one thing I noticed when I was working in the investment bank is that my back started getting really sore. So I ended up going to a chiropractor, and the chiropractor obviously, cracked my back in several places. That was a fairly unique experience that I'd never had before. I think I ended up going there for quite a few sessions until sort of most of the pain sort of went away. So that was actually a pretty good sort of remedial action. Another thing that had happened to me in the lead up to that was that I had actually broken most of my metatarsals in the right foot. So those are basically the small bones that sort of radiate towards the ends of the foot to your toes. I'd actually snapped most of those just from the mere act of walking. So after I'd worked at the investment bank, we just kept saving basically for the few years I was there to go travelling again. So we went for another 6-month trip. One thing that I had learnt from the previous trip was the limitations of me carrying sort of heavy items, I suppose. So I bought myself this sort of little wheelie trolley, probably the same sort of wheel-based trolley that you get in pensioners' shopping carts that they travel around the supermarket with. And I actually strapped my backpack to that to go travelling, which actually worked pretty well. The only painful thing about it is it sort of used to always sort of fall over onto roads at inopportune moments because the stability wasn't that brilliant. And I think it sort of outlived its usefulness somewhere in the Pacific. I can't remember. I think it's probably still circling around an airport carousel in Honolulu Airport, I think. So got back to Sydney and took a job up with one of the world's, if not the world's largest IT outsourcer, and they basically owned one of the contracts at one of Australia's largest financial institutions. So basically I was back in an investment market, financial market type area with dealing floors. So quite high pressure sort of locations, those. And I was still basically suffering a bit from complications. I had to have 1 or 2 toes operated on after I'd been at this place for a couple of years, I think. I'm not quite sure how long. And so I was on sedentary duties for about 3 weeks in the city, in Sydney in the city. And that's when I sort of started to experience the first bit of discrimination that I'd actually had to put up with since I'd had the injury. There probably had been other situations that weren't very sort of eventful leading up to that, but this one just turned out to be fairly bad. What happened was the manager of the site wasn't really too happy about me being on sedentary duties for these few weeks, even though I sort of recovered as much as I could. Behind my back, he'd sort of arranged to ship me off to another location that was about 20 minutes on the train. So I was now faced with not only commuting from my house to the city centre, but also having another trip on a train out to a suburb of Sydney. I objected to this at the time. I said this, this was not something I wanted to do. It wasn't a place I wanted to work, and also, you know, it would sort of increase, I suppose, the amount of pain that I was being put through by, you know, walking to different stations and walking up and down stairs. You know, it was sort of adding to, you know, the pain and the suffering of just getting to work in the first place, really. And I remember when I got out to this site, been there for a couple of weeks, and I was walking down a corridor, and a senior manager was walking towards me down the corridor, and he suddenly just started, you know, to pretend to limp on one leg, and then he switched to the other leg and pretended to limp on the other leg. And as he was walking past me, he basically looked at me and sort of sneered and said, you know, well, you know, which leg is it today? I mean, I was just a bit floored by just the brazenness of this guy's comment, and the fact that he was a senior manager, you know, at this large corporation. It was really disheartening and really disappointing to sort of encounter that sort of attitude. And I sort of decided there that this really, you know, wasn't the sort of place I wanted to work if you know, people of that standing in the corporation had those sort of, you know, archaic, you know, and childish sort of reactions and opinions to someone like myself who had a legitimate condition, was legitimately, you know, impaired basically, and all I wanted to do was just work in a safe environment and a happy environment, and, you know, be productive as an employee. So by this stage I was about 35 years old, I think, 34, 35, something like that, sort of heading into my mid-30s. And sort of had now been in sort of the IT sort of arena for quite a few years. I had quite a lot of experience. And, you know, this is where my career was basically. But I decided I didn't want to work for Evil Corp anymore, and so Renee and I had been saving again, and we went on another 6-month trip. This trip was the mother of all trips. This was the one that contained, you know, every single traveller's sort of dreams, I suppose, of places that you want to go and things you want to do. So we got on a flight to South America and sort of doubled back to Easter Island. Easter Island was just one of these places I'd always wanted to go to. I was just fascinated by the archaeology and the culture. To be in Easter Island and to actually go round Ranaraku and see all the moai, see all those forlorn Easter Island heads, and just soak it all up. It was just, it's one of the greatest places I've ever been. It was just fantastic. Flew up to Ecuador, did a trip into the Amazon, stayed in the Amazon jungle, swam with piranhas, went down to Peru, flew over the Nazca line, and we ended up in Cuzco. We ended up doing the 2-day hike to Machu Picchu. Actually went on a pilgrimage to Gallipoli, and that was, you know, a really sort of spiritual moment for us. I suppose not only for Renee because she's Australian, it's such an embedded part of the Australian psyche, but also for me because, you know, my grandfather had actually been shot there just north of where Anzac Cove is, actually on the same beach, I think, just around Sula Bay. So for me to go there and sort of, you know, soak up the atmosphere of that place and sort of pay my respects really was something I'll always remember. And we came back to Australia, came back to Sydney, came back to our old lives. I managed to secure a job at a New South Wales government department I got an IT contract there and ended up working there for a couple of years on that contract, and it was more sort of project management roles. I was looking after, I think, a metaframe transition, as well as a device consolidation. Basically, they were in the early days of consolidating a lot of separate devices into multifunction devices. So I sort of project managed the New South Wales arm of that, and used to meet up with, used to go to meetings in Canberra with I suppose the affiliates from other states, just to discuss how it was going to be implemented nationally as well. So, that was a really good learning experience. Got a lot of experience sort of dealing with some higher level IT issues, I suppose, and sort of directors, more senior sort of staff. So yeah, I really enjoyed my time there. It was absolutely brilliant. One thing that I did notice, however, in Sydney in the winter was the arthritis was actually pretty painful during the cold months. And Renee and I were getting sort of a little bit over cities, really, over the big city. We were sort of looking for a sea change at that time in our lives. So what we decided to do was we basically just packed the car up and just drove up the coast and just did odd jobs along the way, and I think a couple of months later we landed in Cairns. And but just before we did that, we had enough money just to go on a side trip up to Borneo, and also across to Myanmar, basically the new name for Burma. So the aim in Borneo was to actually climb Mount Kinabalu. So Mount Kinabalu is, I think, just shy of 14,000 feet. It's not a technical climb at all. It's not. I wouldn't be able to do a technical climb. It's more sort of a hike, and I think you start at about 3,000 or 4,000 feet, and then you just can't keep walking up these steps of this massive granitic lump of rock. You just walk up and up and up and up for thousands of steps. You stay the night in a hut at 10,000 feet, and then you get up at a ridiculous hour in the morning in the dark, and scramble your way up the last few hours across these granitic exfoliations right to the top of the mountain. And so that was a 2-day slog, and it's the sort of thing I just had to do. I had to do this. I had to prove I could still do things, and that my disability wasn't limiting my dreams and the things I wanted to do. The most difficult aspect of that was basically going down the mountain. For me, it's exceptionally hard to go downstairs. I mean, just to go down a few stairs is pretty difficult, but to go down thousands of steps in one day was just it was just the most jarring experience I think I've ever had. And the next day, not only was I was having this similar experience that I had on the Charlotte's Pass to Kosciuszko walk, I was my calf muscles as well were just ridiculously painful. If I stepped off a curb, it would be yowling in pain basically. But look, I would go and do that again if I was fit enough or I had the chance. It was a spectacular mountain. The other thing we did on that trip was we flew up to Bangkok and then went and had a look at the the River Kwai and the bridge, and then flew across to Myanmar into Yangon. When I was a kid, I used to look at this book called The World's Greatest Wonders. It was an old black and white book that was published in the 1920s, I think. And as a child, I basically used to flick through that book. I was absolutely obsessed with it. And as an adult, my mum actually sent it to me because of my unnatural obsession with all the pictures. There was 2 pictures in that book that particularly took me. One of them was Easter Island, was the quarry, the Moai quarry, the statue quarry on Easter Island. And the other picture that really amazed me was the Golden Rock, which is a Buddhist pagoda in Myanmar. I think it's called Kayak To Pagoda. It's basically at the top of this 3,000-foot mountain. It's this gigantic boulder that was possibly deposited there by, I don't know, possibly glacial moraine or something like that. I'm not too sure whether the glaciers got down that far, but it was just perched precariously on the edge of a cliff, and it had a sort of a shrine, like a Buddhist pagoda shrine on top of it, and the Buddhists adorned it with gold. It was just covered in gold, and even though it was black and white, this photograph, I could just imagine what it looked like. And this book was a thick book full of photographs all over the world, you know, of all these monuments. But that was the thing that I just wanted to go and see more than anything else in the world. So that's what we did. We basically got on a bus from Yangon. It was quite a few hours, can't remember, and got to the bottom of the mountain and did the pilgrimage to the top. Now, one thing about Buddhist monuments and temples is that you have to take your shoes off. That's not good for me. It is excruciatingly painful for me to walk in my bare feet on concrete, and bad enough just to go in temples in Bangkok and places like that and actually just take my shoes off. I don't avoid it because I want to go in the temple and have a look around, but I got a real shock when we got to the Golden Rock, because the entrance was about 1 kilometre from the actual rock itself, and the whole path was paved with very shiny marble. It was a really wet day. It was drizzling and raining, and I took my shoes off, and I wasn't quite sure how far I'd have to walk, but yeah, that was really, really, really difficult. And when I look back at it, I think, you know, if you want to achieve something, if you want to do something, you know, you have to sometimes just put up with the pain of things, you know. And of course I wasn't going to turn back there, you know. I think it's the greatest distance I've ever walked in my bare feet, because normally I can only stand about, you know, 10 metres or something like that. If it's gravelly, I can't really walk on it at all. It's too painful. So, you know, I stood a real risk of falling over and sliding over, because I'm walking on this deformed foot that just has no grip. I can't move my toes. Everything's stiff. And so I really walked really slowly. It just took us ages just to cover this kilometre. But to get there and see the Golden Rock, and you know, through the mist, and yeah, to finally satiate all my travel dreams was something that I would have always regretted if I'd never done it and never seen it. So yeah, that was a spectacular experience. So we headed up the coast. Landed in Cairns, and pretty much straight away the kids started popping out. So yeah, I had a girl. That was fantastic, and 2 years later I had twin girls. So, you know, within the space of 2 years, I had a family that I had to look after. Lucky at that time because I'd gained a lot of experience in Sydney. The good thing about working in the city is there's a lot of employers, not just government but private sector as well. So, you know, I had a solid, 12 years of working in lots of different IT positions. So when I came to Cairns, because we came to Cairns for a sea change really, we came to get away from the big city. I thought, well, I'm probably not going to get a really good job here. And as it turned out, I ended up getting a pretty good job here with a government department. Because at the time there wasn't a lot of people moving to Cairns, and there wasn't a lot of people with the level of experience that I had. So I won a couple of positions, and ended up in this really good state government job. And I've been there ever since. I've been there for 11 years. I actually love working for the public service. I feel more comfortable in the public service with my condition. I just feel as though this isn't a profit-making enterprise. It's an organisation which is dedicated to serving the public and has basically an altruistic sort of outlook towards providing services for the people of the state, for the people of Australia. So it's sort of married well with my general sort of life philosophy as well, of helping people and being altruistic. Not that there aren't private companies that are like that, but there's just something about being in the public service as someone with a disability as well that I really felt more protected and looked after. So with the public service, I've felt as though I don't need to worry as much about my job security. I don't feel as concerned as I have done in the past about, if you get a tap on the shoulder, well, sorry, you can't do this anymore, you can't do that. They certainly look after you and if you have to do if you're injured or you have to do, different types of duties, they'll make sure that you get the right rehabilitation. So it's certainly an environment that I think is more conducive to peace of mind. One of the problems with my sort of disability is that a lot of people actually don't know I'm disabled. They don't know I've got a disability. I went before a panel of surgeons just to get classified a couple of years after everything settled down, and so they designated me as having a 20% whole body impairment. And I also remember around about that stage, one of the orthopaedic surgeons sort of said to me, he said, well, in terms of broken legs, you're in the top 1% of complications that can happen. So, yeah, thanks for that, Doc. One of my concerns that I've had for a long time is deterioration of my condition. I was told because of my ambulatory biomechanics, because of the way I walked, that eventually other parts of my body would start wearing out quicker than they normally would do. So yeah, really the first thing I noticed was the back, probably about 6 years after the injury. Sort of lower back pain, sort of a stiff lower back. That's sort of been a constant, that's sort of on and off. Sometimes it's worse than other times, but it's mainly due to the muscle stiffness because of the way I walk. I'm sort of clenching the muscles there subconsciously just to keep everything stable. My left knee has also started to develop a little bit of arthritis, which is probably due to all the excess strain I put on the left side of my body. So the left leg, the left thigh, the left calf is actually quite a bit larger than the right side, and basically when I'm walking I sort of wobble on that side, and so there's a lot more strain sort of goes onto that side of the body. One exciting thing that's happened fairly recently with the state government is that they've just released, I think it's a 3-year disability services plan, so which really targets the disabled. It targets improving services and access for disabled people, as well as internally within the organisation, looking at sort of better opportunities, employment-wise for disabled people. So I find that sort of stuff really exciting, and I would basically put my hand up in a flash to advocate and speak on behalf of people like myself. I've had a lot of experience with a long-term injury, a long-term disability, a long-term impairment. I've had a lot of experience with different employers in the private sector, federal government and state government. So, I think I've got a unique insight into the perspective of someone like myself who is disabled, who has a long-term injury, and sort of the relationships within the organisation, with work colleagues, with supervisors and managers. I think my voice is probably one of those voices that probably needs to be heard, and because we're the people who are experiencing this. We are the people who are disabled, who have a disability, who have an impairment, and we're best able to sort of offer advice as to what's working and what's not working, and also really just raising awareness. This is making sure the information is out there, basically, not just externally for the public but internally within the department as well, just really making sure that people have got all the facts, and that your colleagues sort of have some sort of understanding or comprehension of other people in the organisation who may be going through stuff that you just don't have the slightest idea what they're battling with every day. So I've still got dreams of climbing mountains. There's things I want to do before things start really deteriorating. One of the things I did recently with the children was we went for a Christmas holiday down to New South Wales, and we went back to Thredbo and went back to Kosciuszko. So it's the first time Renee and I had been back there since we climbed it from Charlotte's Pass. So the kids were 8 years old, the twins were 8, and the eldest was 11. And I wanted to I'd told them about this for months in the lead up. I said, we're gonna go and climb Kosciuszko. We're gonna go to the top of Kosciuszko, because it's no mean feat for an 8-year-old or an 11-year-old. It's a long way. It's 13.5 kilometres from from the top of the Threadbow past the Eagle's Nest. It's a really long walk, and for me as well, you know, it's a damn long walk. You know, it's like an able-bodied person doing 100 kilometres, me doing 13.5 kilometres. So I've really got to make sure I've got the right footwear. You know, I've really got to make sure the orthotics are comfortable, that nothing is rubbing on my foot, and that I've psyched up to the moment, and you know, I've visualised it, and I know I'm going to basically get to the top. But I wanted it to be a life lesson for the kids. I wanted it to be something they'd always remember. I wanted them to set a goal, you know, and for them to achieve the goal. And, you know, the goal was getting to the highest point in Australia, and I just kept up the excitement, you know, every week about it, and the lead up to it, how, you know, when you're standing on the top of this mountain, you know, you will basically be the tallest person, the highest person in Australia. You know, there won't be out of the 23 million people in Australia, there won't be a single person who's standing on this big island, you know, this wonderful country. There won't be a single person higher than you. And that's the sort of thing that, you know, children can sort of really get excited about and dream about, and it's the sort of thing I know you can look back on, because it's one of those things that will form who you are when you're later in life. You know, just that simple act of setting a goal and, you know, acting on the goal and actually achieving the goal. I think my ultimate aim is to get back to Africa. Climbing Mount Kenya was, at the age of 21, was probably one of the most pivotal moments in my life. It's just something I always remember. And I always wanted to climb Kilimanjaro, which is the highest mountain in Africa at just shy of 20,000 feet. So that's the big one. That is the one I'm going to aim for. I'd love to do it with the kids when they're a bit older, so probably going to have to wait until I'm about 60 before they're old enough. But, you know I'm going to get to the top of it. It's just a question of time. I don't care how long it takes. I will get to the top of that mountain.